look, I know we've been welcomed ourselves, but why don't you just turn to the people around you, shake their hand and say good morning, thanks for being here. Thanks so much for letting a couple of Sydney-siders in. Lilla, it's great to join you as a fellow New South Wales person here in Victoria to have a conversation about where the future of learning's going. And the topic today, the future of learning, is an interesting one, isn't it? You know, there's nothing more natural for educators to do than come and have a conversation about the future. Because in many ways, what we do every day is we turn up to engage young people in the present to prepare them for the future. And so our work is inherently future-focused. But I don't know about you, but every time I start hearing about trends and new changes and being told that we've got to improve on the current metrics, but by the way, we're also questioning the current metrics, we start saying, you know, sometimes the future comes too fast and in the wrong order. I've got a 15-month at home, and sometime in the next couple of days I'm going to have a newborn as well. And so I'm starting to look at what are the new technologies that could help me out, because I need to get one kid out of nappies pretty soon, right? So this is a little thing called the iPoddy. Anyone seen the iPoddy before? I know you've got a lot of emails piling up. There is no adult version available, okay? I can't help you out there. But sometimes I look at things like this. New trends, new thinking. I think, you know what, sometimes the future comes too fast and in the wrong order. Hey, just little hands up. Who here feels like they're educating in a faster moving world? Like it's hard to keep up? Like you just actually, yeah, I'm interested in the future, I'm interested in new things, I'm interested in innovation, I might be involved in new pedagogies, but actually my life normally looks like this. My mother-in-law is a school principal. Yeah, I know, it's pretty tough. Anyone here a mother-in-law and also a school principal? It's pretty tough, I'll tell you. I know my place. But I look at her work and I think every time, she's there working away, trying to get some front focus on learning and teaching, on new strategies. She's got 2 or 3 hours planned out in the diary, kept for this time. And then suddenly it's 2 o'clock because there was a parent, a teacher, a student, someone who needed to grab that time. Has anyone had an experience like that in the last week? This is your life. So how are we going to talk about the future of learning when so often we're in this survival mode of getting through the ever-increasing workload of working with people? And so I'd love to suggest this morning that we move into what I call double espresso mode. I'm a high school science teacher by background. I finished high school, thought I wanted to impact the world through medicine, and then broke my mum's heart at the end of that year and said, I'm dropping out to do something really important with my life. I'm going to go and teach. And I've been a high school science teacher. I remember, I don't know what I did to a deputy principal. Is there a deputy principal in the room? There's a few, right? For some reason, I got given an all-year rate double period of science in the afternoon. I don't know what I did wrong, and they used to come in, especially the boys, sweating, you know, and they'd been playing football and sweating, they look like rabies dogs, and they would just say this, can we light the Bunsen burners? It's the only interesting thing they'd ever done in science with me, or the only thing they can remember. And I used to that morning, I know it's Sydney, the second best coffee capital of the world, you guys can take that one, but I used to always go and stop at a decent barista and order myself a double espresso coffee. Because there's something about holding a double espresso, right? There's sort of possibilities inside. And you think, you know what, this afternoon could be the best double year 8 science class I've ever taught in my life. And I think as we come and talk about the future, as we come and talk about Victoria, who is one of the best systems on the planet, who wants to keep getting better, we need to be in double espresso mode. We need to come together for 2 days and say, look, there's so many reasons that we can say yes, but. Has anyone got a few yes, but sayers in their common room? Just 1 or 2? And we need to move and say, all those constraints are true, but yes, and where might we be going together? So can everyone just put up your hand like this? Just help me out for a moment. Just find a shoulder nearby. Can you shake them and say, wake up your thinking? All right. So what I'd love to do at the moment is to not share my expertise from the classroom, but to share the work I've been doing over the last couple of years, an organisation I founded called Learn Labs. I took off from the classroom to go and study international comparison in education, so I spent a year at Oxford and 4 years at Cambridge. My expertise is in PISA, so you know, talking about ministers with high cases of PISA envy is my doctoral dissertation. And we can talk about that, but what I want to talk about today is some of the lessons I'm learning about how secondary schools just like yours are getting moving despite the constraints and despite the resistance. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So what I'd love to do is open up our conference by thinking about 3 big trends we're seeing that are impacting secondary schooling. But rather than leaving it in the big, then start saying, how might you as leadership teams particularly start to make relentless action in a few areas to get moving over the next few years? So to start off, what are we seeing in the global trends that are really impacting secondary schooling? And how might this actually lead us to consider a different type of vision for the future of learning? So the first one's all about the skill shift. Has anyone done some marking in the last little while? Hopefully we've got other people to do it. But the great frustration actually is the things that we've got very good at teaching and testing actually increasingly don't have as much payout in the workforce. I was in Singapore in April, and one of the things that they're very concerned about is their students wouldn't write this. This is a very Aussie answer, isn't it? But increasingly, we need to have the arithmetic. We need to have those basic foundations, but increasingly we're saying we need to have a broader set of skills as well, as the Minister mentioned. And so you look at a place like Google, not that all of our young people are going to head off and work at Google, but as Google now starts to make explicit what they're looking for in young people as they employ, they say number one is about learning ability. Your capacity to move into a circumstance you haven't been in before and be able to rapidly work it out. Who's needed a lot of learning agility when they first moved into a DP or a principal job? You step in, you've got to work out this culture, work out what's going on, deal with all these changes. Suddenly you've got a whole budget to run. This is what they're talking about in young people. Google looks for leadership. They look for humility. And they look for people who have real ownership of their work. You give them the task once, and just because you haven't followed up doesn't mean they don't see it all the way through. And lastly, expertise. You need to know something if you work at Google. But Google says we'd rather have someone who technically knows less coming in, because if they have the other 4 characteristics, within a month, 2 months, 3 months, they're going to catch up and go beyond anyone who comes in confidently and starts saying, I know enough. Let's listen up to the head of Google and also Sal Khan from Khan Academy and hear what they're looking for in young graduates coming out of our secondary schooling and university sectors.
The problem for us, and what we see at Google, is that some of the people who do well in those things actually you don't want to work with, because they're not great on teams, they're not collaborative, and the best, smartest people actually aren't the ones who always get the best grades.
When we hire at Khan Academy, and we're trying to hire people who can, software engineers and people who can help with content and help us do research, and these are the types of jobs that are, these are the growth jobs of the 21st century, highly creative jobs, and we ask ourselves questions like, what are their logical and critical thinking skills? What's their ability to communicate? How curious is that person? How good is that person at giving and receiving feedback? How empathetic and self-aware are these people? And when we look at a resume, even from a fancy university, from Harvard or Stanford, or we don't know. 3.9 GPA tells us very little about that. It just tells us that they did well on a series of courses.
We do something to kids in our educational system where a child is born knowing nothing, and all they want to do is learn, right? Every experience in the universe is new to you, right? And you're soaking this in, and you're a learning machine. And we grind it out of them in our educational system. And we're taught not to learn. We're taught to memorize. We're taught to be very good at figuring out what it is that a teacher or a manager wants us to do, and then deliver what that teacher or manager wants.
And so increasingly the challenge for us as secondary educators, as secondary educational leaders, is to say, actually, we have a lot of high-performing students in the VCE who often are just learning how to play the game, aren't they? Isn't it frustrating? You come back from a pedagogy conference and you start being really passionate about something like project-based learning, and you start to come back and some of your educators start to put it in place, and the students say, whoa, 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 whoa. You've got a job to do. You've got to get me ready for that exam. And the teachers say, well, I heard this was a really engaging pedagogy. And the students actually say, can you just test it on the younger grades, please? Because we know how to play this game. And so the great frustration for us increasingly is we get held to account on this. And yet we are increasingly convinced, both empirically from what we're seeing in the demand of the labour force, and actually broader, what we've always wanted to do for young people, that the desired outcomes are so much broader. And so one of the first trends, one of the first challenges for us is that there's a skill shift going on, that the things that we've got very good at testing and being measured on actually increasingly are too narrow as predictors of longer term success for our young people. And the second big thing many of us are trying to deal with is the technology shift. This is my first little boy, Sam. This is my little kitchen in Sydney, his wife. And earlier this year I was in Saskatoon, Canada, and minus 35 degrees. And one of the things that strikes me is, here I am on the other side of the planet, and it's quite normal for me, as far as his perspective, to have a long-distance video conference call for free from his living room. Does anyone remember those Christmas phone calls to overseas relatives? Remember you used to all line up around the phone? You say, ready, set, go, hang up, $45. I want you to think about the difference in what he's going to experience. Douglas Adams has a great little criteria of how different people respond to different forms of technology. He says anything that's in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary, it's just a natural part of the way the world works. My guess is no one here thinks, oh, I'm going to go outside this morning and get in my technology, I call it car. You just get in the car. It's not exciting. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary. You can probably get a career in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. And so for most of us, it's about saying, how do we actually get our heads around as leaders, even those who might see themselves as digital natives, we still speak digital with an accent. And so how do we start to consider actually, for a lot of the things that we start talking about of we're going to allow certain technologies in, for them it's not technology, it's just environment. And so increasingly as we think about the impact of technology and learning, we've got to think about the new power dynamics. Has anyone been fortunate to book a holiday in the last year or so overseas? Anyone been lucky to get overseas? Maybe people had sabbatical leave or something else. Well, think back if you were fortunate to go on an overseas trip maybe 10, 15 years ago. Who'd you have to speak to? Travel agent. Remember those days? And they used to plan it all out for you. They say, this is where you're going to go, this is where you're going to stay. You used to fold it out. And they'd tell you exactly where you're going to be and what you're going to do. Well, how do you book it these days? Actually, right now, if some of you would like to, you could be starting to book a future trip. You might ask Facebook, hey, has anyone been to this part of Italy? I'm thinking about doing a trip next year. You might go on bookings.com or Expedia to get the best flight, the best hotel. Has anyone looked at TripAdvisor and decided not to go somewhere, even though it was a good deal or it sounded like it? Using crowdsourced wisdom from other people. You may not risk your credit card, so you use PayPal, and a free app like TripIt pulls it all from your Gmail and puts it in your calendar for free. You see, we love this in our consumer life. What's going on? Well, it's the power to the user, isn't it? That increasingly that middle person who controlled what we would do, how we would do it, when we would do it is increasingly gone, and we love it. We love it in our banking, we love it in our shopping, we love it if we get to book a holiday. But what does it mean for learning? See, what's starting to happen is less a discussion about the devices and BYOD. It's kind of, okay, we get it, we need some devices in there. But the more question is, how do we use this and harness this as a new learning ecosystem? You see, often your teachers are in there now and they're speaking, sharing some content, even this morning, working through some deeper learning exercises. And someone will say, are you sure about that, sir? And they'll say, yeah, I'm pretty sure. Well, it's just that, I found this resource and it says this. When I first started teaching biology back, a decade ago or so, people might challenge me, but it's only because there was two different versions of the textbook in the room. Now, how many information sources are our educators starting to deal with? And it's not just information sources, it's entire video libraries, entire capabilities to cover the content part of our teaching via online teaching resources. Has anyone seen things like this lately? VCE revision videos. People paying either at the school level or at the parental level to watch 8 to 12 hours from the best teachers evidently across the state to learn exactly what they need to know. And increasingly, therefore, some of our students, some of our parents will be combining the great education they're getting in-house with increasing education that they're getting outside. And this will be a huge challenge to some of our educators, because at least some of our students will increasingly be learning without us. That they'll be taking off on their own itinerary of learning, covering things before we've got there in the scope and sequence, wanting to show their work, demonstrate their competency before we're there. And so the technology shift, particularly for young adults, is this great challenge to the new power dynamics of who can access information and who can make decisions in their learning. And the last shift we're seeing over and over again, that's sort of pushing us as secondary educators to reconsider how all this might come together, is about student engagement. Who struggles in some ways with deep engagement for student learning? For some of you, it may well be that students actually aren't turning up all the time. For some of you, they're turning up and they're very test-orientated, but you wouldn't actually say they have a deep engagement in learning. You see, whilst there's lots of opportunities to learn online, most of our challenge is not the technological innovation, but the human-centered challenges of getting all young people to be deeply engaged in their own learning. And the data from around the world looks something like this. This is US data, Canada data, Australia data has this very similar slope. That when you ask elementary school students about their engagement in learning, they're up here. My wife's a primary school teacher. I'm always so jealous of her because she sits up here. When you're getting towards the middle part of school, so 7 through 9, somewhere about 60%. And when you're getting to the high stakes end of young adults, here in our upper end of high school, increasingly under 50% are actually saying they're intellectually and emotionally engaged in schooling. They're often institutionally engaged. They like the place. They love being around their friends. But how do we get all young people to engage in the hard fun of deep learning? How might we redesign learning in some way to get the young adults who are staying with us longer than ever before to deeply commit to their own learning? Because of course the challenge for us who deal with young adults every day is that you cannot learn on behalf of another person. And so our only option is to support our educators to design a pedagogy that's actually intrinsically engaging. So look, very briefly, these are 3 shifts we're seeing that secondary educational leaders in different parts of the world are starting to deal with. And my question is not so much, can we do more analysis of why we need to shift? And it's not even whether or not we've got clear pictures of where we might go. I'm kind of sick of hearing the why and the what. Most of the educational leaders that I get to work with most days want to get into the how. And the how of how to lead innovative change in established school systems just like yours. Has anyone here discovered that sometimes things get delayed in schools? Despite a resolute focus, the strategic plan is out, you get moving, and it's sort of, let's put that off to term 4. Or actually, we may as well push that up to 2016. What about death by culture? Has anyone got some death by culture? The old line that culture eats strategy for breakfast rings true for so many of us over and over again. And sometimes it's death by complexity. That actually the things we're trying to do, use data in different ways, create more engaging environments, are actually so much harder than the type of pedagogies we were using before. Sometimes they don't work because they're going to take a little bit of time to learn how to do. But sometimes our parents don't want change, do they? I fly a little bit at the moment for my work, and I think, what's the equivalent of when we turn up to a group of parents and say, we're going to redesign learning and transform learning? I think it's something like this. Hello, this is your captain speaking. We're going to quickly change the engines whilst we're in the air. We'll let you know when it's done and whether it's worked. But actually, even of our deepest commitments to move learning forward in new and different ways are often frustrated by our parent community. Or the frustration of running more and more professional learning, but in your classroom observations and walkthroughs, finding it very, very difficult to change teacher practice. You know the old saying, primary educators love their students, secondary educators love their subject, tertiary educators love themselves. You ever heard that? You see, we're secondary educators, right? We know our content. Many of us did entire 3 or 4 year degrees in an area. We have a discipline area. And here we are across our schools in New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland trying to work out how do we help people think about their role in slightly different terms as secondary educators. And it's a huge challenge of not so much learning but unlearning. Does anyone here know how to touch type? His hands up proud. Does anyone here type fast but it's not touch typing? Can you show me? Yeah, I kind of do that. I type really fast here on this hand. I only use 2 fingers. And I work really hard, and every now and again I think, I write half the time of my research for a living, I should learn a better way. And so I start to learn, and I literally have to push this finger down. It does not work. And I start doing it, and then guess what? I get busy. And so I say, I'll just write this email, I'll just write this report, I'll go back to what was, hey, it was working good enough, no one was complaining. And over again, I revert back to what was working good enough. I wonder whether that's been your experience in your school. That you've invested heavily for a year or so in professional learning, you're focusing on feedback, you're focusing on co-inquiring with students into their subject, and then things get busy in terms to reports are due, parental teacher interviews, and people revert back. Our challenge actually for a lot of our educators is more unlearning than learning. So how do we make progress? Well, I want to suggest that leadership teams, it's very much a team thing, systems that make progress are adopting a more agile approach to their leadership. And I'd like to suggest that there's one mindset and 3 key strategies that teams on the ground that are working with this methodology are finding that they can actually get moving with. And the overall mindset is you do not need to be fixed, but the best always look to get better. It's all about a mindset of better all the time. You've got to say, wherever I am on the planet, people all know about the Victorian education system. I know you may not realise this here when you read your own papers and your own critiques, but everyone says, oh, I've always wanted to get down to Victoria. I hear they're doing wonderful things down there. And you are, you do. Hence a strategy, as the Minister outlined, that's about learning from within is a great strategy because it's not so much that anything needs to be fixed, but there's great things, but we need to keep pursuing it in new and different ways. I've got an important question for you, but in order to do it, could you please team up and work out who's person A and who's person B? Can you do that for me now? Go for it. Form a pair, form a pair. All right, person A, put up your hand, just self-select, person A, person A, person A. All right, typically if you self-selected, you're the most intelligent in the pair. I don't know whether we got that right. All right, hands up, person B, person B. The best looking, have we got that right? No, we got, all right. So here's what I'd like you to do. Person B, turn to person A and ask them this very important question. What was the first car you ever owned? And more importantly, what was the feature of that car you were most proud of? Do that for me now, you've got 1 minute. Model in the 60s? Any model in the 60s? Model in the 60s? Just super loud voice. What was it? 69 HK Holden. Colour? And what was the best feature of it that you were most proud of?
Bench seats.
Okay. Bench seats. No comment. No further questions. All right. Anyone else with? What about anyone else in the 60s? Anyone else in the 60s? Super loud voice. Go for it, mate.
1962 EK Holden.
Okay. Best feature? Oh, this is too much information. All right. 1970s. Who's got 1970s model over this side of the room? 1970s model. First car. What was it? What'd you have?
A GTS Monaro.
Oh, Monaro. You couldn't do that with current petrol prices, could you? And what was the feature you most loved about it? Went fast. Really fast. Less speed cameras back then. Probably good. What'd you have?
Ford Cortina.
Beautiful. Feature that you loved? Aircon. Did you pay extra for aircon? Of course you did. Do you think about the models you had in the 80s and in the 90s? Remember the late 90s, you would make a decision about paying maybe about 2,000 extra? You used to have all those ads, 2,000 extra for air. How did you listen to the radio? Radio and then CD. Anyone do mixtapes for a holiday? Yeah, the funniest is when you give your students now a tape and a pencil and you say, how do these two things relate to each other? They have no idea, right? Think about the CD players when you could take them out and you think, if I'm parking in an unsafe place, why would I want to take out the CD player and carry it around in my bag? And then all the way through, who's bought a car in the last couple of years? Even if just a baseline model. What are some of the features you've got on those cars? Has anyone got Bluetooth? Hands up. Can you change the radio station from your steering wheel? What about who can now look at a nice little camera to reverse park? It's like a whole new ball game at the supermarket, right? Some of you even got self-park on it. What's my argument? My argument is sometimes out-of-town people like me, especially of my generation, have come in and told people like you, oh, by the way, the future of learning is utterly different to anything we've ever seen before. They start saying, oh, learning anytime, anywhere, and we've got a tablet, so who needs a teacher, and blah, blah, blah. And it's ridiculous, to be honest. It's a narrative that's not really grounded whatsoever in evolutionary change of systems that build on the best of the past and extend into the future. You see, what car designers do superbly is they always say, for each and every model, what are we going to keep? What's working well? Why would we get rid of things that are working really well? But then each and every model gets a little bit better, pushing themselves to think, how do we honour the past? How do we honour the past but continue to design for the future? And so there's 4 key questions that I typically ask as you think, how do I honour the past but design for the future? And I call this a radical incremental approach to change. We've got our systems. There's so much working well in our systems. Why would we spend all this time critiquing it and thinking we need to throw things out? No, instead we need to say over and over again, how do we evolve our systems through asking these simple 4 questions? You know, sometimes I have the honour of being asked to read a school improvement plan or, you know, a whole division kind of improvement plan. And they get longer and longer and the priorities get longer and longer. And typically I just want to know the answer to 4 questions. Hey, what over the next 2 to 3 years can stay the same? As we build for the future of learning, there's going to be heaps that needs to stay the same. Can we just make that clear for everyone so people don't feel like the whole ground is moving from underneath? Every now and again we say, hey, what should be removed? You know, just like many of you don't have a CD player in your car anymore, we don't need it anymore, and so it's crucial to remove. some of your schools have the ghosts of principals past moving through them right now. Little initiatives, little things that were just left there, and everyone's like, well, don't touch it. No, you should. It's just as important in innovation to remove things as add things. Hey, what needs to be tweaked? What's going pretty well, but just a small little adjustment in the way you do professional learning, or a small little adjustment could really get me more gains. And one time, every 2 to 3 years, you go after one thing that's worth really reconsidering. Only one, and you drive it deeply. But the bedrock of schooling is really not going to change.
Emma. Huh? Emma. Emma.
You know, I don't know why we have so many digital learning conferences. You know, the point is not digital learning. The point is better learning. And the point is to say, on what basis or what platform does better learning happen for those who are between about 12 and 18 or 19 years of age? And we know it is relationships, relationships, relationships. The empirical work on the cognitive and behavioral science of learning will play this out, that over and over again, teacher relationships is a crucial factor. But it's not just the sort of individual, but the peer-to-peer relationships. These places of deep connection, of belonging, where young people work through their Erikson stage of development, which is about identity formation. And you cannot do that on a video course online, listening to evidently one of Melbourne's best teachers teach you biology. There's some things that technology can help accelerate and support. But the core bedrock of secondary schooling isn't going anywhere. And I was in Edmonton, Alberta. Has anyone been fortunate to do exchange at all? I know there's some exchanges going on. Wonderful people and educators in Alberta. I'm there every about 3 months in some of the work in high school redesign that they're doing. And I got to Edmonton and went off to a school, and unfortunately I'd been in a conference during the day, and I turned up at a secondary school at 3 p.m. Who is left in a secondary school at 3 p.m., right? Everyone left is trying to finish that lesson and get out the door. And what was amazing as I was there, that these two gentlemen in the middle there wearing hoodies, two young men from First Nations backgrounds, were walking into the building. I was like, what's going on here? Why are they walking in? You want to get out. And they were carrying food. They'd left the school, picked up some food, and they decided to come back into the school to eat that food. And as we sat around with the principal, just having a conversation with them, we found out they were on track to graduate. And I asked one of them, what are your plans for the rest of the year? By the way, graduation rates for First Nation youth in this part of Canada is about 35%. They're totally on track to graduate. He said, I'm actually trying to work out how I'm going to fail the rest of the year. And I kind of looked at the principal like, oh, gee, that's a bit embarrassing. He said, no, I'm on track to graduate. But I know once I leave, I'm not going to have relationships like this again. You see, your schools are places of belonging, of connection. It's about where young people find their narrative. Does anyone hand out Year 12 jerseys at the end of school and they kind of write a nickname on the back? I always think it's weird when I'm in places and I see people walking around with them, and it's 2015, you see these people walking around with class of 2011 on the back, and you think, did you guys just not have anything else to wear? Like, are you a university student or a TAFE student and you've just run out of entire clothes, you refuse to do washing, and this is the last thing at the bottom of the pile you're wearing? No, they choose to wear it. Because it wasn't just that they did a VCE, they did it with you, in your place, in that community. And over and over and over again, that is the killer app for engagement in learning. So with that as the bedrock, and acknowledging that there are other tools that we use to accelerate the learning, how could you as a team get moving? And I'd like to suggest 3 simple strategies that work whether you're at the school level or the system level, to get moving, to be more agile, to not get stuck in analysis paralysis, and rather say we could start to make real progress right now. And you need to clarify your vision for the future of learning in just the next 2 to 3 years. You then need to move to incubate that vision in small pockets within your school or system to work out how to make it work in your place within your constraints. And only once you've got it working do you start to use a strategy of positive contagion to amplify that practice in more places. So let me share briefly these strategies. I'm running 2 workshops later on this afternoon. You might want to come and do a deeper dive on these. But let me try to be of service in a very practical way about leaders who are getting moving despite complexity and despite resistance. So the first strategy is to clarify the what and the how of a compelling learning future. And does your school have a vision for learning at all? Hands up. Some sort of statement about where we're heading. We're here that we're waiting anxiously now for a Victorian vision for learning, where you're all heading. The thing is, I spend a lot of my time in research reading people's visions for learning. I play a little game. I don't tell people I do this, but now you're in on the joke. Call education buzzword bingo. I'll play it with your new Victorian one soon. And what I'd love you to do is, if you get 3 of these words, you yell out bingo. If you talk about these 3 things in your learning. So number 1, personalised learning, collaborative learning, inquiry-based, that's a bit more primary school. We've got too much content to cover for secondary. Technology accelerated. Anyone got bingo yet? New pedagogies, 21st century learning. I don't know what either of those terms mean, but they're great. I see them turning up in almost every school improvement plan. Building lifelong self-directed learners. Who's got something along those lines? We want more of those. Promoting creativity and problem solving. Yep, we got them. And driven by high quality teaching, of course. This is a wonderful discourse. It's the right language. I think it's there. Fullen has crafted about half of it, and that's a good thing. But my real question is, what does it look like in practice? And do you as a leadership team really know, with crystal clear clarity, what you'd like to see in a classroom in 2 to 3 years from now? People say, well, don't use the word classroom, Simon. Use innovative learning environment. I'm like, yeah, I'm with you, but most of us are going to have classrooms. Most of it's going to have a certain number of kids between 25 and 30 or so in a classroom with one teacher in the next 2 to 3 years. So what will it look like as we edge our way to a system that's future ready? And I want to suggest respectfully that sometimes we use this language because we're not yet really clear what we want to see. I read a great book called Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. Has anyone read it? It's about change management. One of the lines that really stuck out to me is this: sometimes what looks like resistance can actually be a lack of clarity. You know, yes, I understand that there's a lot of resistance in the system as we ask people to take on new roles and identities, but are we actually clear on what are the things in teachers' practice that can stay the same? What are the things that we can remove? What might be things to be tweaked? And where are the areas that really need to shift? Are we talking to our teams in the conceptual all the time, using this great language that we use at conferences, or are we getting down to concrete and saying, this is what it would look like in practice? Here, let me show you. Let me model a 10-minute part of a lesson. Let me show you this person doing it. It's really practical, it's clear. These are the things we want to see. And so I call this a postcard of future learning. You know when you used to go on holidays and you send people postcards? Has anyone done that in the last year or two? It's kind of gone now with Instagram and Facebook. But the great challenge of the postcard was choosing which thing to write. You know, which one to choose. You can't have the whole city, and so do I want to choose this snapshot of maybe a city like Paris or this one? And so too, when you look at the future, you can't see the whole thing. When you look at the whole thing, all you can use is use the buzzwords. But when you start to say, hey, look, I don't know what it will all look like, but I used to be I used to be a science teacher. I know lots about Year 11 biology. Can I articulate a postcard of what learning could look like in 2 or 3 years from now in Year 11 biology? What's the teacher doing? What's the students doing? What's the role of assessment? And getting unbelievably specific about what you want to see. Not to prescribe it, but to check whether you as a leadership team know exactly what you want to see in practice. Because to be totally provocative, sometimes I get the sense that we can't lead our staff into new ways of learning because we're not yet really crystal clear on what we want it to be. And once you start to get clear on a rough scope of a picture, just 2 to 3 years out from now, it's time to focus on less but better. Sometimes we turn up to conferences like this and we hear wonderful speakers. You're going to hear great speakers, I know, because many of them are my friends. We've got Dr. Sarah Glover from the Mitchell tomorrow, one of my favourite professors from London. Louise Stoll's going to be here. And you're going to get all these ideas. I'm going to share some. Sarah's going to be speaking about collaboration and her research project at Mitchell. Louise Stoll's going to be talking about building capacity for learning. It's going to be great. And you're going to get all these ideas, and your staff are worried that you're going to come back. They're going to say, oh, he's been to one of those things again. Oh, she took a DP this time as well. Now they're going to be in on it together, right? And they're worried you're going to come back with these many ideas and many initiatives. And my sense is that the next 2 days is about going broad, asking big questions, but at the same time as going broad, asking each other, but what's the next most important thing for us to do? And for some of it, it may be to keep doing what you've been doing so superbly over the last 6 to 12 months. Because so often, because of that challenge of changing practice, when we move too early, that teacher is just starting to learn how to type differently, and at that point we say, hey, now we're on to something else. Want to keep professional learning fresh. But if the challenge is to change the routinized practices of educators who are working under very difficult and stressful conditions, if we keep changing the agenda, we never let them bed down the practice so it becomes habitual, so it becomes effortless. How do we focus on less but better? It's less but better. A few key drivers that really help us get rapid change over the next 2 to 3 years. If you get it done quickly, that's fine, move to the next agenda. But the deep leadership discussion really for you, especially those of you who are as teams or with colleagues in the same network, is to ask each other this question. Hey, what's the next learning design problem worth solving? The next one. Sometimes the analogy I think about for this is to ride a bike. Is anyone a bike rider? Part of the team who hang out at coffee shops wearing tight lycra and things? Terrific. All over Sydney and Melbourne. It's springtime, it's going to start happening again. But I want you to please, whether you wear lycra on a Saturday or not, can everyone just ride your bike for me? Just help me out, come on. Everyone just hold your handles. You can choose what type of bike you want, a low rider, you can have anything. And can you just move your feet and start riding some pedals? Go for the pedals, go, 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 go. And now can you just get to top speed on that gear? Just do it for me. I know some of you are like, there's no way. That's all right, you can leave me hanging. All right, go for it, go, go, go. Now could you change the gear for me? Just change the gear. There it is, you want to feel that? And now you're going faster, all right. Thanks very much. See, at the moment your school is on a certain learning gear. It's going along, and my first question is, are you currently at top speed on that gear? If you're not at top speed on that gear, you don't need to move gears yet. Actually, the core focus is we're on the right driver and we should just keep going until we get to top speed. Nothing more frustrating than unnecessarily changing gears when you still had more speed to get out of the current one. But some of you know that feeling when you're actually already at top speed and beyond on the same gear, your legs almost start doing this, and you say, okay, I've got to go to a faster gear now. And the real challenge for you is to decide on what's the next gear. I don't think there's anyone in the room who can't describe to me exactly where they'd want to be down in the future. But the question is, what's the next most important thing to go after next? And you go after it relentlessly for 24 to 36 months. I'm not going to ask you to do it for me again, but imagine you're riding a bike and you don't really think through and you do a change of gear that's not really enough force through it. What happens? There's some people who are doing it for me. It comes off the current gear. If you're on a good bike, it'll then go back to the gear it was already on, but slower. And if you're on a crappy bike like mine, it'll fall off. You see, over and over again, what I find in school systems is that people choose either the wrong gear, or actually they don't put enough force through it. They do it for 6 months or 12 months rather than 24 or 36 months, and they do it, and it interrupts the current learning cycle. And yes, sometimes, you know what, that is a lot of direct instruction from the front. And they interrupt that, which wasn't perfect, but it was working okay, and they try to move to a new type, but because they don't build capacity, because they don't focus there, all that happens is it disrupts the current learning. Things go grading along for a while, and 6 to 12 months later, we end up on this original gear that we're on. And so the tough work of leadership is to say, hey, what are we not going to do? What are we not going to do as a result of the learning of the next 2 days? I actually think you as principals need to be the chief editing officer, the CEO of your organisation, not in a business way. Hey, what are we going to not do? Because everything is important in education. And the leadership decision is to decide what is the next most important thing. What should we do next? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes as a pair. Person A and person B, head back in that little pair. Person B, can you ask person A this question? Hey, what's their hunch at this point, and it's going to change over the 2 days, the most important learning design problem your school should work on? And why would solving this be a gear changer for your work? If you want, and there's a few of you on Twitter, you can put it out on the hashtag. We'll come back in about 3 minutes. Go for it. All right, can I get you to come on back? So the aim of this is to open some loops rather than close them. This would be a question you can ask each other over coffee and over lunch. Okay, number one, what we're trying to do over the next 2 days is to really clarify where do we think we need to go next. You might end it and say, look, I've just got a list of another 10 things I'd love to do. But right now I think we've got more speed to get out of our current gear, and we're going to stay the course on this for another 6 or 12 months. But it's not that the other things aren't important, they're coming. They're just not the next most important thing to work on. So after you clarify, and it doesn't have to spend a lot of time, on one page, this is where we think we're heading. The next most important thing to do is to not try to get buy-in from your whole staff. If I had an idea in the next 2 days and start to think about it, the worst thing I would suggest doing is to go back and just mention at the common room, hey look, I got inspired about a few things, we heard some work on collaboration going on, capacity for learning, so stay tuned, there's more coming your way. Because suddenly people start saying, uh-oh, there's some more changes going on, we've got change at the state level, now change at the school level, it just feels uncertain. Now I find the schools and networks of schools who make the most progress first say, how might we incubate this idea by enlisting a few learning designers, some key people who step forward to create this powerful approach to learning within our context, which often means within our constraints. And so these leaders say, you know what, I am actually going to start much smaller than I want to. I want to change learning across my school or across my network, but I'm going to start smaller. I will learn quickly, and I'm going to be willing to fail well for the next couple of months as I work out how to do it. And I'm suggesting this based on some research I did looking at other innovation sectors outside of education and how they do it. Because in education, typically we get inspired at a conference, we start a committee, we write a plan, we get a budget, and about 12 months from now we try to roll it out to everyone. And what you find in other sectors is they do it differently. I call this see whether my slides are going to work, the big slow hit miss approach to innovation and change. I have a big idea, I'm slow into implementation because I've got to get buy-in and budgeting and rollout plans, and then it either works or it doesn't. And you find in other sectors, they say, well, education would be too complex to plan all the details beforehand. Rather than doing that, we're better off starting really, really small, moving quickly into learning, and iterating as we learn from all the things that are working and not. And so the starting point for schools that make progress say, hey, how might I work in the white spaces with those who already believe? Do you have some staff who already believe? Some of them are keen, newer teachers and they're ready to get going. Some of them are keen, more experienced teachers and they're ready to get going. Some of them are on your leadership team, some of them are heads of faculty, some of them are frontline teachers. Whatever it is, there is a network of people who are already willing to get going and they do not need to be convinced. That's where you begin. And the white spaces means it's not in any plan. It's not in any announcement. The first step is just to get moving. Yes, even this term or early term 4 with these people. And you pull them together and say, hey, we think this is the next problem. Let's surface this. Let's test this idea with you. And now we're going to start unbelievably small to test whether this idea might work out. 1 or 2 lessons in one subpart of a faculty. One change to an element of assessment at the end of a scope and sequence for this term or next. And what you find that you do is you make one small change. You launch it. You assess its impact. And then you learn and iterate. You're running fast, frugal little experiments to check whether or not you can make this work in your place. You see, I find most innovation isn't about having very new ideas. Now, there's plenty of good ideas in education. The innovation journey is how do you make them work in your context, within your constraints. And so rather than piloting, does this work or does this not? How might we prototype together, learning in and through practice, what is working and what's not, trying to find a way for it to work in our place. Because I actually don't believe there is a what works in education. But it sounds kind of provocative in a time where we're talking lots about evidence, and I love evidence. The problem in education is there's really not a what works, but what's working for whom under what conditions. And so our job as schools is to explore how do we actually get this to work in our place. Or we want to do some project-based learning or more authentic assessment. We want our students to co-inquire with our teachers. Well, we've got some ideas from the evidence base about how that's worked in the past, but how do we make it work for us? Moving through these cycles, learning as we go, and being willing to fail well. You see, education is really, really important, and so it means we can't innovate at scale and just see whether it works or not. But we can iterate, small little prototypes, learning what's working and what's not. When it works, we persevere, we keep going, and when it doesn't work, we pivot. We come back together as a small team, we say, what are we learning about what's working, what's not working, and how might we just change our approach a little bit in the next cycle of testing to see whether or not we can get this to work with this group of students. And so our work as educational leaders, leading innovative change, is to be willing to experiment in small little prototypes. And as things work and things don't, we get a huge amount of learning from it. When it works well, we persevere. When it's not, we pivot. And we iterate and we iterate and we iterate until we can make it work within our conditions. I was fortunate to do my PhD study at Cambridge in education, but a lot of my friends there were doing PhDs in science. Then at the end of 4 years, they would write a conclusion which pretty much said in science, this didn't work. And they were told that that was a really good PhD, because in science they call that data. In science they say, you've got to publish that, we've got to learn from that. And so how might we actually be willing to learn from the things that aren't working, share that learning around, so that we can find solutions that'll work the next time? So this time, can the other person in the pair share first? Just this brief reflection question on Incubate. Who are the staff and students that you could quickly mobilise as a networked innovation community, the people you'd work with first? My hunch is you wouldn't touch year 11 and 12. Why would you stress those students out who've been enculturated into a system of learning? But who could you get started with? Which faculty area, which stage area, which grade level could you get moving with first? Have that discussion. I'll pull you back in 2 minutes. Go for it. All right, can I get you to come on back? So the starting point is a good enough clarity about where you think as a leadership team things might want to head, and what might be the key drivers of that. And then you pull together a small team. Some of them you tap on the shoulder. You might just say, hey, we're going to be doing some work on this if anyone wants to join us. It's open. And then you test this idea with them and co-create with them. You're not trying to get buy-in from people until you've got the proof points of how it works in your system. Because the best response to someone who says, that can't work with our people, is, well, it's actually already happening in maths. It's actually already happening in grade 9 assessment in the second term of how we do that summative assessment. We're not doing it the way we used to. So respectfully, we'd love you to come and see how we're doing it and learn from them. That the first step is to clarify, and the next step is to incubate rapid prototyping cycles until you can show it can work within your constraints and within your conditions. So the last strategy, as you start to clarify as incubators, of course you don't want to leave it in the pockets. And so now we have to move to an amplifying strategy of spreading within our school, within our system, what's working from some of the pockets to the rest. And the minister mentioned it before, didn't he? You know, across the system, there are great pockets of learning that don't always play out across every school. And I'm sure you all experience it. You say, oh, if only I could get more of that head of history. Oh, it's amazing there. And then if I could just drag that across to this other area, science or languages, everything would be how I want. How do I move the pockets to make them the new normal? And so the question is not really a change management question. It's not how do we define what everyone should do and roll that down and get compliance. But it's a spread question. Asking the question, under what conditions is it likely that promising practices move from one classroom to the next, from one faculty to the next, from one level of the school to the upper school or the upper school down to the lower part of the secondary school? How does it work? And I find number one is that the practice better be simple, reliable, and effective. Sometimes in the digital learning discussion, people say, oh, look, I handed out all these devices, my teachers don't use them. I say, okay, well, before we use the label of resistor, let's ask about their experience. And sometimes people tell us of experience where they, the night before, gave up watching television, engaging with their family, and they actually prepared a new digital empowered learning lesson. They walked in, they got it all set up, the students came in, and then they found half of them couldn't log on, 2 of them couldn't get online, and 1 or 2 were going crazy. Has this ever experienced to you? And so we call them a resistor to digital learning. They say, oh, actually, no, this is not simple. It wasn't reliable. It wasn't all that effective. I'm going back to the analog world that was working well enough, thanks very much. And so as an incubation team, it's about getting these practices really simple, really robust. Do these work even when connectivity is high or low? It doesn't have to involve technology. Is this the sort of practice that a normal person can do? You know, sometimes we get people to go in and we'll watch some keen, often a Gen Y teacher do some incredible lesson. We think we're going to somehow change this person's practice if they could only watch this person doing this amazing thing. We look at it and they look at it and say, that person must not need to go home and do anything in the house. They must have half their weekend free to prepare this lesson. This is a wonderful lesson, but it's not what a normal person can do with a couple of kids or with a sick parent or with a renovation going on. This is something you can do for a little bit of your career. But I need practices that are effective and useful that I can do even in a normal amount of time for a job. And so how do we make these practices simple, reliable, and effective? Not just things that special people can do. And once we've got that, how do we create these social pressures and supports to get those practices moving from one classroom to another? And I think the best evidence on this is that compliance approaches just do not work, and instead we need to apply a social nudge. Sometimes I look at other sectors and ask, how do other sectors ensure that the best practices developed in some parts of the system move to other elements? And there's a surgeon from Boston, his name is Dr. Atul Gawande, and he writes about health change. And I sometimes think we as education need to get out from within our own sector and say, how do other people think about change? And sometimes we incorrectly say that in health what happens is there's a new finding in the evidence and all the doctors and all the nurses just use that practice. And a terrific article he writes called Slow Ideas about how these practices move from one person to another in health. He argues this: people follow the lead of other people they know and trust when they decide whether to take it up. Every change requires effort, and the decision to make that change is a social process. Who finds this true in their own school? That actually when it's about compliance and top-down and movement, we get very little. The system responds back with the same force as we push on it. But when we open up social learning, when we start to not get that keen young Gen Y teacher to share her practice in front of everyone and instead get a typical teacher who's been trying with this for a couple of weeks to share and say, I don't have it all right, but here's what I'm doing, we suddenly realise that that person is more trusted within the common room and therefore has a bigger impact on change practice than getting the perfect person up the front. We have to cultivate social learning. It's about helping those pockets of great practice, whether it's a faculty or a group of teachers, to move out, and when they interact with other faculties or other teachers, not to be frustrated and head on back to their own group again, but rather to have that contagion effect. Savvy individuals who, rather than going and saying, hey, do you want to come and watch me, do this practice so you can copy it or you can learn from it, say something like, would you mind coming into my classroom and evaluating and giving me some feedback? I'm trying some new things and I'd love your expert opinion on it. And so that more experienced teacher comes in watching this teacher use a new practice, but he or she keeps her position of power and status. They're there to evaluate, they're there to give feedback, and as they're doing that, they're having an incredible opportunity for social learning in a trusting environment, and they start saying, wow, I could do a bit of that, that'd work. And bit by bit, you build the trust. And so I find actually that schools and systems transform at the speed of trust between your most innovative educators and the rest of the system. And so the amplification strategy is about saying, how do I actually get those really keen people who I've been doing incubation with, ready to engage with the rest of the staff with respect, with trust, with consistency and openness, until we start to win more and more of them over time. You don't need to win the whole group. You need to win about 35 to 40%. And most educators will tell you by that time you're starting to win the culture and it starts to roll on from there. So my last feedback question as we think in pairs is this one. How could you better build trust among staff in order to accelerate social learning? Have a minute on that one and then I'll pull it together and we'll be done for the morning. Go for it. All right, can you come on back for me? So with each of these strategies this morning, in the brief time that we have, I'm just trying to open some loops. Open some loops that might be the basis of discussion over coffee, over lunch, with colleagues from your school, across other schools. Hey, what are you really trying to do? Can you clarify? Can you use concrete, tangible language where people can understand what would it look like in our school in 2 or 3 years from now? And what's the gear change you're focusing on? And number two, what are the small group of people you could pull together just in the next, whatever we've got, 12 weeks left or so of this calendar year, and say, how might we incubate just some of those practices even before this year ends to see whether or not we can make it work? And as we're starting to get those pockets and we move into the next year, we can start to amplify that, not rolling it out to everyone, but spreading it one faculty to another, one teacher to another, bit by bit, until those practices are simple, reliable, and effective. Until we've unlearned the old way and had a chance to embed the new way. So where do we end? Well, I think it's the call to never stop learning. That actually as the world speeds up and we find that we're trying to lead learning in faster moving times, then clearly we as educational learners and leaders need to be some of the most agile learners on the planet. And so it's terrific that you've taken this time out to come together as a community and say, well, what's working, what's not working, what are you doing, how could I make this work in my place? Because as the world of education speeds up, we as leaders of learning need to give ourselves time to be the most agile leaders on the planet. And so wherever your school is up to, whether you're a newish school or whether you're a 100-year-old school, I think the words of Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, ring pretty true. He always says every day is day one. Every day is day one. Wherever we're up to, we can go further. So from me to you, thanks so much for the opportunity to come and share a little bit this morning. I look forward to working with some of you in the workshops as we embed this down in your context this afternoon. And if you'd like some slides, I pulled them into a PDF and put them up on a link which will come up on the screen in just a moment. All the very best. Thanks so much.